Hi there, it's Wraith, and I just wanted to say thank you. So many people have signed up for memberships to wraithrain.com because they want to support the podcast, and of course, to get access to the unedited, sexy chapters. If you are thinking about becoming a member, I want to make sure that if you join, you explore everything my site has to offer. It's not just the podcast. I know it's cliche to say it, but the audio chapters really are just the tip of the iceberg. I'll tell you more about everything else you get on the serial site at the break. For now, let's get on with the chapter.
Last time on Everdark, Balthazar took Christian on his first hunt. Everdark, Episode 24, The Hearer of Prayers. Daemon slid out from underneath Julian. His fledgling made a sleepy objection that had the vampire king petting the young man's hair and tucking him more fully underneath the soft down comforter. The coolness of the room, after the warmth of Julian and the luxurious mattress, had him shifting uncomfortably. He longed to stay curled around his fledgling until Julian woke. The next section of the podcast has been abridged. Perhaps then it was best that he needed to commune with the earth, with his skin touching soil and plants and grass. He needed to reconnect to this world after he'd been gone so long. It would remember him. Planets had memories that put immortals to shame. This communion would aid him in recovering his powers more quickly. If Julian had been awake, Daemon suspected he would want to be utterly present with his fledgling and would neglect this necessary act. So it was definitely best that he let Julian sleep. Newly made fledglings needed far more sleep than older vampires, let alone an immortal such as himself. Even before the sun dipped below the horizon, he had been fully awake, despite his need to commune. He sat beside Julian, though, for a long while, one hand resting in the young man's soft hair. His mind was quiet. He was content. In this moment, finally having the one that was meant to be his all along, he knew a measure of peace he had never known before. He had no thoughts outside this moment. That would change, of course. He would want to know what happened to the other immortals. He would want his full strength returned. He would be restive not having established himself among his people. But for now, the ache that had plagued him for innumerable years was finally satisfied. Julian, I hope you dream of good things. I hope you are at least half as content as I am. He leaned down and kissed Julian's temple. Another sleepy sigh was his reward, and he couldn't help the grin that crossed his lips. Julian was so very young and full of questions and excitement. He was impressed with how readily Julian had engaged in their blood-sharing the night before. He thought he would have to coax Julian to take even a sip. Even now, there was a stain on his fledgling's skin around his mouth and down his chin to show how very eagerly he had drunk. He recalled all too well Asha's first fledgling. She had refused to drink and nearly perished as the thought of consuming the life force of humans appalled her. She had felt it was cannibalism. No matter the pleasure it brought her, she had refused sustenance. She only succumbed when she reverted to a full predator and could not stop herself. She ravaged a whole village. It was a lesson about the thirst. One must always listen to it or fall into madness. Julian clearly thought of feeding as something to be enjoyed, if not reveled in, while Daemon would have to warn him of it. He doubted that Julian would ever experience it. This was good. Julian needed to be strong. He already wanted to be independent. Daemon would give him some room to move, but he was the master and the king. He would protect and guide the young one on his proper course. The next section of the podcast has been abridged. It was time he communed. He did not dress, as his bare flesh needed to be in contact with the earth for the powering up process to work. Besides, his clothing had not yet been cleaned. He would have to see about getting more to wear from Balthazar. He was curious about these modern clothes. Not that they ever could compare to his own in Night Valen, but still, With a fledgling of this time, he would need to learn its ways as well. Yet he had no sense of shame or conspicuousness about his body. So, without hesitation, he pattered out of their suite and into the hallway of the coach house, completely nude. He was striding down the stairs when he met Arceus coming upstairs. Arceus jerked to a halt in mid-step. His gaze was riveted upon Daemon's groin. His eyes swung down to Daemon's feet, then quickly up to his head. Arceus tried to bow, but being on the stairs made this impossible. Daemon waved him off. It was unnecessary for such formality.
My king, I was just coming to see if you require anything.
Arceus stammered out. His gaze now was very firmly upon the ground, which Daemon found strange. Did he think he must avert his eyes? Some of his subjects did that, but Arceus already felt much closer than them. A guide in this brave new world, even if he had touched Julian without permission.
Perhaps you were wondering about clothing. We have a tailor scheduled to come later this evening. Also, we are having some ready-to-wear items in various sizes and styles being delivered.
Is my nudity distressing to you in some way? Daemon asked. Speaking out loud was tiresome, but to connect minds was actually tiring, and he needed to conserve his strength.
No, of course not. You are perfectly formed,
Arceus hastened to say. Yes, Daemon agreed. Arceus let out a strangled laugh and ran a hand across his forehead.
You sound so like Balthazar when you say that.
Daemon snorted. I am sure he pretends to think well of himself no matter what the truth of the matter is. I am merely stating a fact. This body is meant to be pleasing to your kind. Arceus's head jerked up. His mouth opened, but no words came out at first, even though it was clear that a million questions raced through his mind. Daemon was beginning to suspect that these vampires had no understanding of the immortals. He was just as clueless as to how matters stood. Walk with me. I must commune in the garden. We may speak between here and there, Daemon suggested. The vampire king crossed his hands behind his back at the wrists and proceeded past the goggling vampire. Arceus quickly hurried after him. Daemon had the distinct impression the man still wanted to cover him up, but was resisting mightily. Arceus was wearing a floor-length black robe with heavy gold jewelry. Yet despite the ornateness, there was a sense of modesty about the garment. He wondered if Arceus would rip it off his own body and offer it to him if Daemon asked. Unlike the others, especially Balthazar, Arceus had accepted him as king already and would do almost anything he asked. Because of this, he must be careful.
You said that your body was meant to be pleasing to us. Does that mean that you have a different body originally? We know nothing of your kind, really, only that you came to Earth, and not even exactly when, and chose the strongest among the humans to...
What we were, we are no longer, Daemon answered swiftly. We adapted, our souls swimming through the dark until we found new hosts when our old hosts were incapacitated beyond repair.
Hosts? Traveling? I have so many questions.
Arceus cried, but then bit his lower lip.
But I can see that you are not inclined to answer them.
Not all of them, and not now. Daemon gave him a small smile. That seemed to placate the man. Arceus drew his hands down the front of his robe and then hid them in his sleeves. This stance seemed to calm him further.
I am sure you're not surprised by my interest, but there is a greater need for correct information than simply to satisfy my own curiosity.
Arceus explained.
You see, I don't even know where to begin. We have many myths about you and the other progenitors of the bloodlines. Damaging ones.
Everdark started as a written story published on the website wraithrain.com. And that's what Wraithrain is mostly about, my writing. Like Everdark, all my stories are gay, romantic action and adventure set in imaginary worlds or alternate versions of our world that include shifters, elves, vampires, and magic. I write these stories serially, which means one chapter at a time, like fan fiction or web novels, and publish each chapter as soon as it's done. I always have 3 or 4 stories I'm updating at the same time. One of these currently is Everdark Academy, which is the sequel to Everdark. What happens to a serial story when it's done? It's left on the site, along with all the member comments. I've been doing this since 2010, so I have a ton of completed gay romantic stories to binge read. One of these completed stories, of course, is Everdark, so if you absolutely can't wait to find out about what happens, you can read all 147 chapters of it. And then go on to Everdark Academy.
They had just reached the foyer of the coach house. 2 vampires were standing there. It was the little fighter from the night before, William, and the one who listed his powers off in an awe-filled voice, Isabel. They had been speaking quietly, with her fussing over him. William still looked pale and distraught, likely not having fed last night because of being too upset, but also because Daemon had required so much from their acolytes. He frowned at this. He was not pleased that he had taken so much from this house that was obviously struggling on its own, but there had been no other choice. He would start hunting tonight. Julian would surely enjoy it. When the 2 of them caught sight of him, their mouths dropped open. He was truly surprised that nudity had such an effect on these modern-day vampires. Or perhaps it was just his nudity that was doing this. He was uncertain. He would have to figure this out, as he adored letting the night air caress his skin. Isabel immediately dropped to her knees once she regained her composure. She tugged at William to kneel too, but he resisted her.
We're to treat him as a guest, not a god, Isabel.
William hissed in annoyance, though he did give Daemon a worried look.
We've already gotten into enough trouble with Balthazar,
she reminded him.
Kneel.
William was about to, but Daemon held up a hand, shaking his head. I do not require anyone to kneel to me, especially those who do not believe in me, he said quietly. William's silver eyes darted up to his face in surprise.
It's not that I don't believe in you. I mean, you're right here.
He paused, then said,
You have all the powers the stories say you're supposed to as well. I just...
Say nothing more, William.
Isabel cried frantically. I wish to hear what he has to say. It will not offend me, Daemon assured her.
Of course, my king.
Isabel still looked miserable, though.
Be very careful with your words, William,
Arceus urged the child vampire. He wasn't sure this was any better of an idea than Isabel did. William stood very tall, which still did not even have the top of his head reaching Daemon's shoulder, and said,
The Immortals used us to fight their battles without regard for our welfare. After we overthrew them, some of the ones that had fought in those battles were so damaged that they continued the abuses with their own fledglings. My old master Roan Tithe was like that.
Daemon felt a sickness well up in his stomach. Fledglings were a treasure. They were not soldiers. They were companions. He had heard a little of this vampire Roan Tithe, but he sensed that there was so much more that would cause him to hate the man. If he was not already struck down by Balthazar, then he would have done it himself. William's arms crossed over his chest, and he shuddered as he said,
He did unspeakable things to us, and the only person who stopped him was Balthazar. The Order did nothing. The other powerful house leaders did nothing. The Council did nothing. Only Balthazar stopped the things.
Daemon wanted to tell him that there was no need to speak of the atrocities that were committed against him and the others, but his mouth remained stuck shut. He did not wish to interrupt the flow of William's words. William might need to speak these things, and he needed to hear. As king, he was to have protected them, but instead he had slept. The vampire child's voice steadied then, and he continued,
After that night, I determined that I would only follow those who had earned my loyalty and respect. I may have failed at times.
He swept one hand through the air.
But I keep my promise to myself.
Daemon respected that. He had respected that William was willing to fight for his friends and house members, no matter how unworthy they might have been of such loyalty. William had clearly believed they were worthy, so he had stood up to an impossible-to-defeat enemy. William's eyes met Daemon's, unblinking, as he challenged in a voice soft and low but full of conviction.
So you might be king, you may be the first among equals, but that does not mean I will follow you. You said that you would have killed Heath and Celine for less than coming into Night Valley and attacking Julian and Christian, but I wonder how much less. Are you a tyrant too? Will you seek to abuse your power? Do you want slaves, followers, worshippers? Or are you like the king they write of in the stories that Arceus tells us, who will raise all of us up?
Arceus tells stories of me. What kind, I wonder? Arceus and Isabel held themselves very still. This was the moment of truth. Who was he really? The king, yes, but what kind? That latter question was the one that William was asking. In his youth, he might have struck down this boy for speaking to him in such a direct way. But time had shown him that wisdom curbed one's acting out on foolish pride. And besides, he admired William all the more for standing up and stating what many others would simply be too frightened to ask. He kept his gaze on William, softening his tone perceptibly. I am not the king because I say I am. I am only the king if you recognize me as such. That recognition can never be earned by compulsion or force or violence. Not true recognition that you feel in your heart. William's pink lips parted in surprise. He felt a wave of relief mixed with happiness flow through the other two. They had already believed him good, or hoped he was. He reached out with one hand towards William's cherubic cheek in a silent request to touch him. William tipped his head, so that only the tips of Daemon's fingertips were touching his smooth as silk skin. He guessed that this was a success, to touch William at all. But those are just words, William. Watch what I do, and make up your own mind, Daemon said, and stroked that tender cheek once before drawing his hand away. William was wounded. He had been abused. Daemon would have to win him over slowly. It might not work at all, but he would not harm this being more. William curled his arms around himself, looking thoughtful but still very uncertain. Daemon made a motion to Isabel to rise and care for William. She got to her feet and placed an arm around William's slender shoulders. Daemon bowed and told them, "Have a good rest of your evening." He then proceeded out of the coach house and into the garden with Arceus walking slightly behind him. He smiled wryly as, once again, every vampire who caught sight of him nude froze in place before pretending this wasn't unusual. Arceus, where is a place in the garden I might commune, where I will be inconspicuous? Daemon asked as yet another couple of vampires stared at his groin.
I take back what I said about you being like Balthazar. He would have been strutting with all this attention.
Arceus murmured. Daemon snorted. Perhaps I should send you in for my coat, though I must commune nude.
I will be happy to fetch it once you're settled.
Arceus offered. Arceus then led him to a side garden filled with a small, bubbling fountain that was still running despite the chill air. The grass was neatly raked, free of leaves. The grass was cold against his knees and calves as he knelt down.
Would you permit me the honor of praying with you after I get your coat?
Arceus asked. Praying? I am not praying, dear Arceus. I am restoring my power through connection to the earth, Daemon answered. He paused for a moment and asked, Who do you pray to, Arceus? Arceus lowered his head.
Though exiled, I still consider myself a confessor of the order, and that means I pray to, well, to you.
Daemon was the one to go very still this time. He realized then more than ever before that he needed to understand this world. Finally, he said, Please feel free to join me after you retrieve my coat. Arceus bowed and went to leave, but Daemon called him back. And Arceus, can you begin to bring me any books, scrolls, or documents that explain what happened with the other immortals and the vampires up to the present? Arceus nodded. but then with a slight hesitation said,
I will bring you a device that will allow you to access a vast library. It's similar to one of the wells in Everdark.
Daemon's eyebrows rose. Humanity has come so far. Or have vampires?
Both. Well, I'll leave you and return shortly.
Arceus said with another bow, and this time he disappeared into the rest of the garden. Daemon laid his hands on his knees, palms towards the heavens, and let his eyelids shut. He then reached for the power of the earth.
Though exiled, I still consider myself a confessor of the Order, and that means I pray to, well, to you.
Arceus's voice drifted over to Fiona. Her heart began to race the moment that she heard him. She swallowed and kept her face neutral in expression, as Confessors Donato and Sloane were looking to her to know how to react. And she didn't kid herself that one or both of them might be eager to report to Daemon any misstep she made. Being emotional about Arceus would easily be considered a punishable offense by the prickly and precise preceptor.
Who is Arceus talking to? I don't recognize him as a member of House Ravenscroft,
Donato asked from beside her. They were on the roof of the nearest house to the Ravenscroft mansion. It was half a mile away, but she didn't dare go any closer, though the listening equipment and their own enhanced sensors weren't giving them very clear feedback. Yet even here, she felt exposed, though they had amulets that came from the Helm bloodline, so they should be invisible unless they moved. Yet merely being invisible didn't mean they didn't give off sense that the House Ravenscroft vampires could pick up on a stray gust of wind. But they needed to know what was going on in there. Yet she had been so overcome with just hearing Arceus again that she hadn't actually been listening, let alone analyzing what he'd said or who he'd been speaking to. Fiona internally cursed herself. Sloane added,
He said he prayed to this vampire. And is the guy naked?
Fiona repositioned her high-powered binoculars to catch sight of this allegedly naked vampire that Arceus was speaking to. Arceus had lovers of both sexes, so it was conceivable what they had arrived upon was a loving session. Why else would this other vampire be naked?
Maybe just an exhibitionist.
But she immediately discounted this.
An exhibitionist that Arceus prays to? He only prays to...
Her binoculars focused on a single male, naked figure who was kneeling perfectly still on a rectangular section of grass near a fountain. Even from this distance, she could see the perfection of his form. He was big, as Arceus liked his men, but also lean of line. He had thick, black hair with natural waves. His features reminded her of Greek statues of the gods. His head was bowed and his eyes were closed. She suddenly wished very much that he would open those eyes. Arceus was nowhere in sight. He must have left. Another reason to curse herself for losing track of things.
What the hell?
Sloane hissed, and there was a slight scraping sound as she moved on the roof. Fiona grimaced and was about to caution her to be silent when she realized what had caused the woman to react in that way. Tendrils, red and glowing, were erupting from the earth all around this figure. They wound around the naked vampire's body in a lover's caress. Their ends sank into his flesh and they began to pulse.
What is that?
Donato gasped.
It is like the earth itself is giving him its lifeblood.
Fiona whispered out loud. And at that moment, as if he had heard her, the vampire's eyes opened. They were as red and glowing as the tendrils that surrounded him. He looked right at her. Fiona grabbed the two confessors by the napes of their necks and yanked them off of the roof. They let out startled gasps as she launched them into the air. They fell the 2 stories to the ground, but each of them landed on their feet.
Run,
She told them, her heart in her throat.
Run as fast as you can.
The 3 of them rabbited into the darkness. She wasn't certain when it would be safe to stop running. She wasn't sure it ever would be.
Arceus would only pray to King Daemon. King Daemon. That was him. Oh, by the immortals, that was him.
Join us next time for episode 25. Fine.
There's another part of the membership content on wraithrain.com that I haven't talked about in a long while, I think, and that is the manga. I love manga, and I post several pages each month according to the schedule. Working with these talented artists is so much fun. They get to produce their best work without a grueling schedule, and sometimes you'll get manga that is too hot for Amazon, such as The Werewolf Next Door, which is straight up sexy times for over 100 pages, with werewolves. If manga or reading isn't your thing, but you still would like to join to support the podcast, thank you so much. Getting to run Wraith Rain is my dream job. And even though we're not even through volume 2 of the podcast on the public podcast, but we are going to be on the private one, just so you know, we're committed to all 147 chapters of it being produced at the high quality you've experienced so far. So until next week, I can't wait to speak with you again. Take care, guys. Bye.
The Everdark podcast by X Aratare is performed by Edward Fox, Adam Riley, Jay Thillis, Bruno Devant, Kelly Michaels, and Hannah Hart, with Liz Gentle as Seer. Edited by Matthew Prince, continuity by Adrielle Wiggins. Everdark is produced by Wraith Rain Publishing in association with Her Grace Reed Studios. Copyright 2022 by Wraith Rain Publishing.